Welcome to Family Revenge Secrets, where stories of betrayal, sacrifice, and justice unfold like the lives we all quietly fear and sometimes secretly root for. If you want to hear more tales of love twisted by deception and the strength of those who rise above it, make sure to subscribe and join our growing family of listeners. Today's story is called The Mother Who Gave Everything and the Email That Shattered Her World. Juliet Roberts was 50 years old when her life began to tilt. On the outside, her story looked enviable. The kind neighbors nodded at approvingly when they saw her carrying fresh loaves out of her bakery or setting pies to cool on the window ledge. She had spent 3 decades kneading dough, counting pennies, and swallowing exhaustion so her only child, Daniel, could have the life she once only dreamed of. Her bakery wasn't just a business, it was an anchor. In a town where strip malls rose overnight and old houses disappeared without warning, Juliet's bakery smelled of permanence. Warm bread, cinnamon, and vanilla, the kind of scents that wrapped themselves around a person and whispered, "You belong here." Customers called it homey. Juliet called it survival. Every paycheck, every late night, every burn on her palms meant Daniel could attend school, wear clean clothes, and one day walk tall in his firefighter's uniform. And Juliet had succeeded. Daniel was 28 now, strong and broad-shouldered, the kind of son mothers prayed for. He had married Allison 2 years ago, and Juliet had smiled through her tears that day, believing she was finally passing the torch into capable hands. Allison was polite, if distant, and Juliet chose to believe time would close the gap between them. After all, family was everything, and she had given her whole life to making sure hers stayed intact. Julian, her husband, played a different role. A self-proclaimed businessman, he wore fine suits and carried himself like a man forever on the verge of closing a deal. He traveled often, attended dinners in Dallas or San Antonio, and came home late with the scent of cologne clinging to his shirt. Juliet told herself he was tired, overworked. After 40 years together, habit had replaced passion, but comfort was its own kind of love. She told herself that, too. The house itself was modest. A white 2-story with blue shutters, a porch that sagged a little but still held her rocking chair. Inside, it smelled faintly of yeast and sugar, even on nights she didn't bake. It was the kind of home you'd think unshakable. And Juliet, folding laundry or wiping down counters, thought it was, until one night. Julian had returned from another so-called business dinner, muttering about partners and contracts, loosening his tie as though it choked him. He left his phone carelessly on the sofa, the screen lit just long enough for Juliet to notice the small glow of an unread message. It was nothing unusual until she read the words. "You were incredible tonight," Dad read. Juliet froze, her hands still damp from the dishwater. For a second, she thought she had misread, that her tired eyes were playing tricks. But the message glowed, undeniable, each word pressing into her chest with the weight of a hammer. Incredible tonight? Dad, the heart. The language was not of business partners nor colleagues. It was intimacy disguised in the flimsy veil of technology. And yet, it wasn't her. She hadn't touched her husband that way in years. Their intimacy had dwindled into polite pecks, a squeeze of the shoulder, the occasional thank you over breakfast. Whatever incredible meant, it belonged to someone else. Her heart raced as if she'd been caught doing something wrong, though all she had done was look. She told herself to put the phone down, to walk away, to forget she had seen anything at all. But the words carved themselves into her memory like initials scratched into old wood. Juliet's home, once warm with the comfort of bread and family dinners, suddenly felt cold, the silence between its walls a living thing. She stared at Julian, already asleep on the couch, his chest rising and falling with a snore she once found reassuring. Now it mocked her, the rhythm of a man too comfortable in his lies. She glanced at the clock on the wall, the one her late mother had given her as a wedding gift. Each tick felt accusatory. Each tick whispered, "Something is wrong. Something is broken." Juliet picked up the phone again, her hands trembling. The message was still there, short and sharp, but the sender's address was nothing but a jumble of meaningless letters and numbers. No name, no photo, just a ghost. A ghost who had claimed her husband's body, her husband's affection. For 40 years she had sacrificed, working, waiting, hoping. She had handed her youth to Julian, her dreams to the bakery, her heart to Daniel. And in a single line of text, all of it seemed to unravel. Juliet put the phone back, careful, quiet, as though the device itself might betray her. She moved through her house like a stranger, her footsteps soundless against the wood floor. She tried to return to the sink, to the dishes waiting in lukewarm water, but her hands shook too violently to hold a plate. Outside, the night was calm, crickets humming, the moon casting a pale light over the yard. Inside, Juliet's world was shifting, rearranging itself into a pattern she could not yet see, but she felt it. She felt it in the hollow of her chest, in the bitter taste rising in her throat. She was a mother who had given everything, a wife who had endured, a woman who had believed in the strength of sacrifice. And now, with one message, she was something else, a woman standing at the edge of betrayal, staring into the dark. The story of Juliet's family, her sacrifices, and her unraveling was only beginning. Juliet lay awake that night, staring at the ceiling as the clock ticked toward dawn. The house was so quiet it ached, yet her mind would not rest. Words kept circling in her head, glowing like embers. "You were incredible tonight, Dad." She whispered them silently to herself, testing how they felt on her tongue, as if speaking them aloud might reveal a mistake. But each time they sounded the same, impossible, cruel, undeniable. When the morning sun crept through the curtains, she moved through her kitchen like a ghost. She cracked eggs into a pan, toasted bread, poured coffee into Julian's favorite mug. The rituals of 30 years came automatically, her hands obeying while her heart recoiled. Julian shuffled in, his hair rumpled, the scent of expensive cologne still faint on his shirt. He kissed her cheek as if nothing had shifted in the night, as if the world were not tilting beneath them. "I've got a meeting later," he said, sipping coffee without looking at her. "Don't wait up." Juliet nodded. Her smile was practiced, a mask she had perfected long ago. Inside, though, her stomach twisted. She wanted to ask where, with whom, why does someone call you Dad with a heart at the end? But the words stuck. A confrontation now would only drive him further into shadows. She needed to see. She needed proof. When he left, she sat in silence, hands curled around her own mug, the bitter coffee cooling between her fingers. She remembered her mother's old advice: a wife knows. Even when she doesn't want to, she knows. Juliet moved to the living room, picking up the jacket Julian had tossed carelessly on the sofa the night before. She slipped her hand into the pocket, feeling around the seams, the fabric, until her fingers brushed paper. A receipt, crisp and new. She unfolded it and read the words: a steakhouse in San Antonio, a bottle of Cabernet Sauvignon, dinner for two. Julian had told her he was in Dallas. He hated the drive to San Antonio, or so he claimed. But here it was, proof in ink, a night spent with someone who liked expensive wine, the same wine he had once bought her for their 10th anniversary. Juliet sat down heavily, the memory of that evening years ago washing over her. The candlelight, his smile, the clink of glasses raised to her success when she opened her first bakery. She had believed it then, believed every word, every gesture. Now the memory soured, like bread left too long to mold. She took out her phone and snapped a photo of the receipt. She didn't know why, instinct maybe. A record. Something she could hold onto when her mind tried to convince her she was imagining things. By evening, her suspicion had grown claws. She wandered to the garage, drawn as though by gravity to Julian's old SUV. The air inside was stale, faintly sweet, and she recognized it immediately. Perfume. Not hers. not the soft rose water she wore. Something sharper, more floral, invasive. She opened the glove compartment and froze. A small tube of lubricant lay inside, the cap crusted with residue. Juliet's throat closed. Her husband hadn't touched her in years. He always claimed fatigue, the toll of age. The intimacy that once stitched them together had frayed until it was nothing but memory. So who was this for? Her hands shook as she returned the tube exactly where she had found it, careful not to disturb the scene. She wiped her palms with a napkin, scrubbing until her skin stung, as though she could erase the betrayal clinging to her fingers. Under the back seat, she found bald napkins, their fabric soaked in the same perfume. Juliet held one to her nose, inhaling the proof of another woman's presence, the vulgar scent of intrusion. She took photos of them too, her phone capturing what her heart could not yet say aloud: evidence. Back inside, Julian was already snoring on the couch, the television flickering unattended. Juliet sat at the kitchen table with her phone in her lap, scrolling through the pictures she had taken, the receipt, the tube, the napkins. Each image felt like a stone stacked on her chest. She could barely breathe beneath their weight. She looked at Julian from across the room. His face was slack with sleep, untroubled. He looked like the man she had married, the boy from San Diego who once promised her the world. She wanted to wake him, to scream, to demand the truth. Instead, she remained still, her rage solidifying into something colder, harder. Juliet understood now. The silence in her home was not peace. It was secrecy. The quiet was not comfort. It was absence, a void where honesty should have lived, and she could no longer ignore it. That night, as she lay in bed beside Julian, listening to the rhythm of his breathing, she stared into the dark and made herself a promise. Whatever he was hiding, whoever had taken her place, she would find out. No more pretending, no more blind devotion. The sacrifices of a mother, a wife, a woman, they deserved more than betrayal. And Juliet would uncover every truth, no matter how much it broke her. Juliet woke before dawn, the sky still painted with the faintest gray. She rose quietly, not to disturb Julian, and stood by the kitchen window watching the streetlights flicker. Her hands moved automatically, boiling water for coffee, arranging trays for the bakery, but her mind felt detached, as though her body belonged to someone else. She had always believed sacrifice carried its own reward, that if she worked hard, loved deeply, and endured, life would repay her with security. For 30 years she had lived by that belief, and for 30 years it seemed true. Daniel was the proof. He had grown into a strong, dependable man, the kind of son who still hugged his mother in public, who still said thank you after every meal. But now, with one text and a trail of evidence, Juliet was discovering that sacrifice could also be a trap. It could blind you until the ground beneath your feet collapsed. The bakery opened at 7, as it always did. Customers filed in, smiling at her, praising the smell of fresh bread, ordering pastries for their children. Juliet smiled back, her lips curving out of habit. No one noticed the shadow in her eyes. She was good at hiding things. She had hidden exhaustion for years. She could hide fear now. Between orders, she wiped the counter, her cloth moving in slow circles. She thought of Allison, her daughter-in-law. Juliet remembered teaching her how to make the family's traditional flan in the early days of the marriage. Allison had laughed nervously, spilling sugar on the counter, and Juliet had patted her hand, saying, "It's all right, dear. Baking is about patience." She had imagined a bond growing, one woman welcoming another into the family. Now, each memory burned. She replayed Allison's polite smiles at family dinners, the way she kept her distance from Julian, as though they barely tolerated each other. Juliet realized it had all been performance. They had fooled her, fooled Daniel, fooled the neighborhood. That evening, alone in the quiet house, Juliet sat at the table with the photos she had taken on her phone. She scrolled through them slowly, the images lighting her face in the dark room. The receipt, the tube, the napkins. They were fragments of a puzzle, but the picture was becoming clear. Still, part of her resisted. She needed certainty. She needed more than scraps of suspicion to shatter the life she had built. Her hands trembled as she reached for the old address book she kept in the kitchen drawer. Flipping through yellowed pages, she found the name, Mrs. Miller, an old friend, a woman who had once mentioned she knew a private investigator. Juliet dialed, her voice shaky as she asked for the number. Later that night, sitting on the sofa with Julian snoring in the bedroom, Juliet whispered into her phone, arranging a meeting with the investigator. She hated herself for it. Hated that she was inviting a stranger into the most private corners of her life. But what choice did she have? She could not rely on Julian for the truth. He had surrendered that right the moment he lied about Dallas. She turned off the phone and sat in silence, the only sound the hum of the refrigerator. She pressed her palms to her face, trying to remember the last time she had felt truly loved. Not appreciated, not tolerated, but loved. She thought back to San Diego, when she was just a girl with long hair and dreams larger than her means. Julian had been charming then, full of plans. He had looked at her with a devotion that seemed unshakable. She had believed him. 40 years later, she was here in a quiet house, gathering evidence against the man she once trusted above all. The clock ticked steadily in the corner. Juliet thought of Daniel, unaware of the storm building around him. He loved his father, respected him. He trusted his wife. Juliet's chest ached at the thought of what the truth would do to him. She wanted to protect him, shield him from the cruelty of it all. But she also knew that shielding him meant allowing the lie to grow unchecked. Sacrifice had defined her life, but for the first time she wondered if her sacrifices had been misplaced. Perhaps she had given too much to a man who didn't deserve it, too much to a dream that was never real. She stood, poured herself a glass of water, and stared at her reflection in the kitchen window. Her face was lined with years of labor and love, her hair streaked with gray, her eyes weary. Yet beneath the weariness was something else, resolve. Juliet had been a mother first, a wife second. And now it was time to act not as the obedient partner she had been for decades, but as the protector of what truly mattered, her son, her livelihood, her dignity. The house remained silent, the same as always. But in Juliet's heart, something had shifted. She was no longer content to carry her suspicions like secret weights. The truth was out there, waiting to be uncovered. And she would find it, no matter what it cost. The cafe was small, tucked into the corner of Main Street, with worn wooden tables and the faint smell of roasted beans that clung to the air. Juliet chose a seat near the back, her body angled toward the window as though she might escape at any moment. Her fingers twisted the edge of a napkin, folding and unfolding it, while the bell above the door chimed with each new customer. She had never done anything like this before, summoning a stranger into her private life, exposing her wounds, but secrecy had become unbearable. She needed eyes that weren't clouded by love, ears that weren't dulled by years of compromise. She needed the truth, stripped of excuses. The door opened again, and this time it was him, Thomas, the investigator Mrs. Miller had recommended. He was not what Juliet expected. He wore a plain blue shirt, sleeves rolled at the cuffs, his face weathered but calm. His eyes, sharp, watchful, seemed to see everything at once. He scanned the cafe, spotted her, and walked over with a steady gait. "Mrs. Roberts?" he asked quietly. Juliet nodded. Her throat tightened around the simple act of saying yes. She gestured to the chair across from her, and he sat without fuss, pulling a small notebook from his pocket. "You said you had something for me," he prompted gently. Juliet reached into her purse and placed a flash drive on the table. Her hand lingered there a moment longer than necessary, reluctant to let go. "Photos," she said, her voice hushed. "A receipt from San Antonio, a tube I found in his car, napkins that smelled like perfume, and," she paused, swallowing hard, "a message I shouldn't have read. It called him Dad with a heart. Thomas didn't flinch. He simply nodded as though he had heard countless variations of this same heartbreak. He plugged the drive into his phone, swiping through the images with a neutral expression. He scribbled notes in his book, his pen moving quickly. "Mrs. Roberts," he said after a moment, "I understand. I'll begin surveillance this afternoon. You'll hear from me as soon as I have something concrete." Juliet clasped her hands together in her lap. The word concrete echoed in her ears. It was what she wanted, what she feared. Proof that her suspicions were not shadows but substance. "Thank you," she whispered. Her eyes burned, but she held the tears back. "I only want the truth, whatever it is." Thomas met her gaze, and for the first time since she sat down, she felt a flicker of reassurance. "I'll do my best," he said. Then he slipped the flash drive into his pocket, rose, and left as quietly as he had arrived. Juliet remained there, staring at the empty chair across from her. Around her, life went on as usual. A young couple laughed over a shared muffin. A man in a suit tapped furiously at his laptop. The barista called out an order for cappuccino. It all felt distant, muffled, as though she were watching life from behind glass. She walked home slowly, each step heavier than the last. By the time she entered the bakery, the familiar scent of flour and sugar greeted her like an old friend, but it no longer comforted her. Instead, it reminded her of the decades she had carried this business alone while Julian pursued deals that kept him away from home. She had built this, stone by stone, loaf by loaf, and now she feared he might be planning to take it from her. The hours crawled by. She busied herself with invoices, kneading dough, anything to keep her hands moving. But her mind replayed every moment of the cafe meeting, every word she had spoken. "You'll hear from me as soon as I have something concrete." It was past 9 that evening when her phone buzzed. Juliet wiped flour from her hands and picked it up. A message from Thomas. Her pulse quickened. She opened it, her heart pounding. It was a photo. Julian in his favorite light blue shirt, stepping into a restaurant with a woman at his side. The woman's hair was loose, her dress dark, her lipstick bold. Juliet's breath caught as she zoomed in. Allison, her daughter-in-law. Juliet dropped into a chair, her knees suddenly weak. She stared at the image until her vision blurred, until she could no longer tell where one betrayal ended and the next began. The man she had trusted for 40 years. The young woman she had welcomed into her family, taught to cook, hugged like a daughter, together, walking hand in hand like lovers. The phone buzzed again. Another photo, the two of them seated at a corner table, candles flickering between them. Allison leaning in close, Julian lifting his glass to toast her with a look Juliet hadn't seen in decades, not even when she was young and he had promised her the world. Juliet pressed her hand to her chest, trying to steady the storm raging inside her. The cafe, the receipt, the perfume, the tube, each clue had pointed here, and yet seeing it confirmed crushed her in a way suspicion never could. She saved the photos to a separate folder on her phone, her fingers trembling. She needed to keep them safe, to catalog every detail. Date, time, place, she had to be ready. That night, she didn't sleep. She sat by the kitchen window, the glow of the street lamp spilling across her face, and watched the empty road. 40 years of sacrifice stretched out behind her, a life built on trust and loyalty. Now, with one photo, it was rubble. Juliet thought of Daniel, her son, the man who still believed his family was whole. She thought of the look on his face when he learned the truth. Her heart broke not just for herself, but for him. The clock struck midnight. Juliet didn't move. She whispered into the silence, her voice raw but certain, "They will not take everything from me." And with those words, Juliet knew the battle had only just begun. The morning after the photographs arrived, Juliet stood in her bakery kitchen, her hands buried in dough. She pressed and folded until her knuckles ached. The simple rhythm that once calmed her now felt like an act of survival, as if kneading could keep her from falling apart. She had told no one what she had seen. not Daniel, not Mrs. Miller. The pictures of Julian and Allison were hidden on her phone, but they burned like fire in her pocket. Every time the device buzzed with a new order or a reminder, Juliet's stomach lurched, expecting more proof of her undoing. By noon, she was exhausted from pretending. Customers praised her pastries, chatted about school and church, and Juliet smiled, nodded, bagged their bread as if nothing in her world had changed. Only when the bell above the door stopped chiming and the last customer left did she finally collapse into a chair, her apron dusted with flour. Her phone vibrated again. A message from Thomas. "Mrs. Roberts, I have something else for you. Can we meet?" Juliet agreed, though her chest felt like it was filled with stones. They met in the same cafe, the small table in the back now their unspoken rendezvous. Thomas slid his phone across the table, the screen glowing with a series of new images. Juliet forced herself to look. Julian and Allison were not in a restaurant this time. They were leaving a law office downtown, papers tucked beneath Julian's arm. In another photo, they stood in front of a hotel, their bodies close, heads tilted toward each other. And then a video, shaky, distant, but clear enough. On a balcony, Julian held Allison by the waist, and she leaned her head against his shoulder. Their lips met in a kiss that made Juliet's breath hitch in her throat. "I followed them into the parking lot," Thomas explained. "They spoke about contracts, about transferring assets. I didn't hear everything, but I caught enough." He tapped his notebook. "They mentioned the bakery, your bakery." Juliet stared at him, her pulse hammering. "What about it?" Thomas's expression softened, but his words were firm. "It seems they're planning to move it out of your hands, to have ownership transferred to Julian and eventually Allison. They spoke about notarizing documents." Juliet gripped the edge of the table until her fingers whitened. Her bakery. The shop she had built from nothing, carrying sacks of flour heavier than her own body, rising before dawn for decades. The business that had paid for Daniel's schooling, that had kept food on the table when Julian's deals brought nothing but debt. And now this. She swallowed hard, the bitterness sharp in her throat. "He's never signed a contract for the bakery in his life," she whispered. "He never stood behind the counter. He never burned his hands pulling bread from the oven. That place is mine." Thomas nodded. "I believe you. But they are serious, Mrs. Roberts. They are meeting lawyers, drafting documents. I'll get you recordings if I can. You need to be prepared." Juliet barely heard him. Her mind was spinning back through years of memory. The first morning she opened the doors, her mother's photograph propped beside the register. The day Daniel brought home his first paycheck from the fire station and insisted on buying a cake from her bakery, not anywhere else. The regular customers who had become friends, who called her bread the heart of the town. She had thought betrayal was a matter of hearts. Julian's heart given to someone else, Allison's heart poisoned by disloyalty. But this was worse. They weren't only stealing affection. They were plotting to take her life's work, her identity, everything she had built so her son could inherit more than empty promises. Juliet sat very still. Around her, the cafe buzzed with quiet conversation, but she felt as if she were sitting in the center of a storm. The walls seemed thinner, the air sharper. The ground she had stood on for 50 years was vanishing beneath her feet. When she returned home, Julian was already in the kitchen, pouring himself a glass of wine. He looked up and smiled faintly, as though nothing in the world was amiss. "Tough day at the bakery?" he asked, his voice casual. Juliet forced herself to answer with equal calm. "Just long, you." "Meetings," he said, swirling the wine in his glass. "There's an opportunity coming. I'll tell you more when the time is right." Juliet's stomach turned, but she kept her face still. She set her purse down, her hands steady even though her pulse raced. She watched him drink, watched the way he avoided her eyes, and knew that every word was another stone in his wall of lies. Later, alone in her room, Juliet pulled open the drawer where she kept old photographs. She laid them on the bed one by one. Daniel as a boy, his face smeared with chocolate, the bakery on its first anniversary. Julian holding her hand at the county fair, long before lies had taken root. She traced the edges of the photos with trembling fingers. Sacrifice had carried her this far, but sacrifice alone would not protect her now. She would need clarity. She would need strength. And above all, she would need proof strong enough to shatter Julian's plans and expose Allison for what she truly was. Juliet pressed the photos back into the drawer and closed it with a soft click. The house was quiet, but inside her, something had changed. For years, she had endured in silence. Now silence was no longer an option. She whispered into the dark, her voice steady at last, "They will not take what is mine." And for the first time in weeks, Juliet felt the weight in her chest shift into something else: resolve. Juliet moved through her days like a figure made of glass, fragile, transparent, and terrified of shattering. The bakery, once her refuge, had become a stage where she performed the role of a cheerful shopkeeper while her heart tightened with every smile she forced. Customers noticed none of it. They praised her bread, thanked her for remembering their usual orders, and left with paper bags warm in their arms. Only Juliet knew that every loaf she baked felt like another mask she was forced to wear. At night, the silence in her home grew heavier. It was not the comfortable quiet of old age, nor the restful hush of two people at ease with one another. It was the silence of secrets, thick and oppressive, pressing down on her until she could hardly breathe. Julian ate dinner across from her, his words as rehearsed as lines from a play. "I'll be late tomorrow, another meeting. Don't worry, I've got everything under control." He never looked too closely into her eyes. Perhaps he knew what he would find there. Juliet began to record the details of each day, scribbling in a small notebook she kept hidden beneath flour sacks in the bakery's back room. Dates, times, receipts, photos, all entered with careful precision. It was her ledger of betrayal, a collection she could not trust to memory alone. She had learned in these quiet days that lies could erase years if left unwritten. She would not allow that to happen. In the afternoons, Daniel sometimes stopped by, his firefighter's uniform streaked with soot, his smile tired but genuine. He would lean against the counter, sipping the coffee she poured him, telling her about the emergencies he had faced. A warehouse blaze, a highway accident, a family rescued from their burning home. Juliet listened with pride swelling and sorrow gnawing. He spoke of saving lives with the same simplicity she once used to describe baking bread. He was good, honorable, pure in ways his father no longer was. "Dad's been busy, hasn't he?" Daniel asked one evening casually. "All these meetings." Juliet's hands stilled on the tray she was wiping. She forced her face to soften. "Yes, busy," she replied, her voice steady. "But that's your father, always chasing work." Daniel nodded, unconcerned, and went on describing his shift. Juliet smiled where she could, laughed when it seemed right. But when he left, the hollowness returned. She wanted to protect him from the truth, yet she also knew that protecting him meant feeding him lies, and she was tired of lies. Each night she returned to her home, to Julian's absence. He came in late, smelling faintly of alcohol, sometimes of perfume, sometimes of nothing at all. He dropped his jacket on the chair, loosened his tie, and collapsed into bed with a groan. Juliet watched him from the doorway, wondering how he could sleep so easily while the life they had built was cracking beneath them. One night, as she folded laundry in their bedroom, Julian entered, humming a tune off-key. He tossed a set of documents onto the dresser. "Complicated business stuff," he muttered. "Maybe you can look them over tomorrow, Juliet. You've always been good with the details." She pretended not to hear the tremor in his voice, the subtle test he was offering her. She picked up the papers, scanning them briefly. The words blurred together, but she recognized enough: transfer, partnership, equity, her bakery. Her hands shook, but she placed the documents neatly back on the dresser, as if they were nothing at all. "I'll read them later," she said evenly. Julian kissed her on the cheek as though he had just invited her into a shared secret, then wandered off to bed. Juliet stood there, staring at the papers. The silence of the house pressed down harder than ever. When she finally slipped into bed, she lay awake beside him, her eyes open in the darkness. She thought of Daniel's smile, of the innocence that still lingered in his trust. She thought of the bakery, her life's work, now written into contracts meant to erase her. And she thought of herself, not as a wife, not as a victim, but as a woman who had given everything and would not watch it stolen. The silence had once been her prison. Now it became her weapon. She would let Julian believe she was blind, let him believe she was powerless. All the while, she was gathering strength, piece by piece, proof by proof. Juliet turned onto her side, listening to the steady rhythm of Julian's breathing. She whispered so softly the night itself seemed to carry her words away. "You think I'm silent because I'm weak, but silence is only the beginning." And in that moment, she was no longer just surviving. She was waiting, preparing, becoming. Juliet woke before dawn, her body tense as though she had never slept. The air in the house felt heavy, filled with the weight of all she now knew. Julian's breathing was slow beside her, the deep rhythm of a man too confident in his secrets. She slipped quietly from the bed, careful not to wake him, and padded down the hallway into the kitchen. There, on the small wooden table, lay the stack of papers Julian had so casually dropped in front of her the night before. Contracts, transfer agreements, legal language meant to disguise theft. She touched the top page, her fingertips brushing across the ink, and felt something inside her harden. They thought she would be too blind, too trusting, too old to notice. They thought silence would make her surrender. Instead, silence had sharpened her. She pulled out her phone and scrolled to the number Thomas had given her the night they met in the cafe. Her thumb hovered for only a moment before pressing call. "I need you," she whispered when he answered, her voice steady but low. "I need everything you can find, every word, every recording. They're planning to steal the bakery. I want it all documented." Thomas promised he would. His tone was professional, but Juliet heard something else there, respect. Perhaps he saw in her what she was only beginning to recognize herself, a woman unwilling to be erased. That afternoon, Juliet received another message, a short audio clip. She pressed play, her hands trembling as Julian's voice filled the kitchen. "Don't worry, Allison. Juliet trusts me too much. She won't suspect a thing. These contracts will go through and soon the bakery will be ours." Juliet closed her eyes. The words were knives, but they were also proof. She saved the file, then copied it onto a flash drive she kept hidden inside the flour bin at the bakery. No one would think to look there. That evening, Daniel stopped by as he often did after a long shift. He pulled up a stool at the counter, his uniform smelling of smoke and sweat, and sighed as he took the cup of coffee Juliet poured for him. "Rough fire?" she asked softly. He nodded. "Warehouse on the east side. Took hours to control. Everyone's safe, though." His voice carried pride, but also exhaustion. Juliet studied him as he sipped his coffee, his strong hands wrapped around the mug. He had inherited his father's broad shoulders, but his spirit was hers. Steady, kind, unshakable. She wondered how much longer she could protect him from the truth. "Daniel," she began, her voice careful, "do you ever feel like things aren't what they seem? That maybe people closest to you are hiding something?" He frowned, puzzled. "What do you mean, Mom?" She hesitated, then shook her head, forcing a smile. "Nothing. Just tired talk, forget it." But Daniel did not forget. He looked at her more closely than usual, as though sensing the storm brewing behind her eyes. He said nothing more, though, and soon left, waving goodbye with a weary grin. When the door closed, Juliet sank into a chair, her hands trembling. The urge to tell him everything nearly broke her. But she couldn't, not yet. He needed proof that would be undeniable, something so clear he would not have to choose between his mother and his father, his wife and his loyalty. That night, she acted. She pulled open a drawer in Daniel's old room, finding the recorder she had once bought him for his college lectures. It still worked, though the batteries were corroded with age. She cleaned it carefully, slipped in fresh batteries, and tested the red light until it blinked steady. Then, while Julian showered, she slipped into the bedroom and placed the device behind a row of books on the nightstand. From there, it could capture everything, every word uttered when he thought she wasn't listening. She draped a family photo in front of it, the four of them smiling at Daniel's wedding, Allison's arm looped through Julian's, Juliet herself beaming with pride. Now, that same photograph hid a truth waiting to be revealed. Later, in bed, Julian spoke softly into his phone, thinking she was asleep. Juliet kept her breathing slow, her body still, as she heard him murmur, "Yes, tomorrow night. She'll be out signing a contract in Nashville. Come by the house. We won't need hotels anymore." Allison's laughter spilled faintly through the receiver. "Finally, we'll have the place to ourselves." Juliet's stomach churned, but she did not move. The recorder was catching everything. Proof, evidence. The kind of truth that even Daniel could not deny. When Julian ended the call and settled into sleep, Juliet lay awake beside him, eyes open to the darkness. The silence that had once suffocated her now felt like armor. Every tick of the clock was no longer an accusation, but a countdown. Tomorrow, she would not be alone. Tomorrow, the truth would be undeniable. And when the truth surfaced, it would not just destroy Julian's lies, it would free her from them. The next day stretched on like an endless shadow. Juliet moved through her routine as though her body was a machine, rising early to knead dough, preparing trays of pastries, smiling at customers who chatted about the weather. But every moment was soaked in tension. Tonight, she knew, the walls of her home would bear witness to something far greater than lies. The recorder was in place. The evidence was gathering. And Daniel, her son, her pride, the reason for every sacrifice, would soon be forced to see what she had seen. Juliet dreaded that moment even as she longed for it. By mid-afternoon, her phone vibrated in her apron pocket. A message from Thomas. "They'll be at your house tonight. Be ready." Juliet slipped into the storeroom, out of sight of customers, and leaned against the wall. Her heart pounded. She thought of the way Daniel had looked at her yesterday, concerned, almost suspicious that she was holding something back. Tonight, there would be no more holding back. When the bakery closed, Juliet walked home slowly, the setting sun staining the sky with streaks of gold and crimson. Her house stood at the end of the street, ordinary and unremarkable, the kind of house where neighbors believed nothing extraordinary could happen. Yet inside, extraordinary things had been festering for months, maybe years. Julian was already there, drinking wine at the kitchen table. He looked up when she entered, smiling faintly. "How was the bakery today?" "Busy," Juliet answered simply, setting her purse down. He nodded as though pleased by this answer, as though it confirmed something he wanted to believe, that she was still the same, still blind, still manageable. Juliet turned away before he could read the truth in her eyes. Later, after dinner, Julian claimed he had more business calls to make. Juliet excused herself quietly and stepped out the back door. Her neighbor, Mrs. Peterson, greeted her with a knowing glance and led her into her living room. Juliet had arranged it earlier. She would wait across the street, listening through her phone connected to the recorder hidden by the bed. From there, she would know the moment to act. The hours crawled. At 10, headlights swept across the front lawn and Juliet's heart seized. Through the window of Mrs. Peterson's house, she saw Allison step out of a cab, dressed in a floral dress. Her sunglasses pushed up on her head, though the night was dark. Julian opened the door for her quickly, scanning the street before ushering her inside. Juliet's hand trembled as she lifted her phone. In her headphones, the recorder transmitted their voices, muffled but clear enough. Julian, at last, we don't have to hide anymore. Allison, laughter, sharp and cruel. The old hag's gone, isn't she? Juliet's throat tightened. She wanted to rip the headphones off, but she couldn't. She had to hear it, every vile word, every betrayal. The bed creaked, more laughter. Then Allison's voice again, smug. How soon can we move the contracts forward? I want the bakery, Julian. I want it signed, sealed, ours. Juliet pressed her hands together until her knuckles whitened. Proof. More than suspicion, more than photos. Words that cut so deep even Daniel could not dismiss them. It was nearly midnight when Juliet called her son. She spoke calmly, though her insides shook. Daniel, can you come to Mrs. Peterson's house? There's something you need to see. Bring your trust and be ready for pain. He arrived minutes later, still in his uniform, his face etched with worry. Juliet led him to the window. Across the street, the glow of lamps poured from her bedroom. She placed the headphones in his hands and whispered, "Listen." At first, Daniel resisted. "Mom, what is this?" "Just listen," she insisted. His jaw clenched as he slipped the headphones on. The voices came through, Julian's laughter, Allison's whispers. The words were unmistakable. Daniel's face paled. His hands shook as he ripped the headphones off, staring at his mother in disbelief. "Dad and Allison?" His voice cracked. Juliet placed her hand on his arm, steadying him. Her own tears were held back by sheer force. "I'm sorry, son. I tried to protect you, but you deserve to know." Daniel's breath came hard, ragged. He pressed his fists against his temples as though he could crush the sounds out of his memory. "All this time, I trusted her. I looked up to him." His voice broke raw. How could they? Juliet pulled him into her arms. For the first time since he was a boy, Daniel let himself collapse against her, his broad shoulders shaking. He wept, not with the tears of a child, but with the deep, guttural sobs of a man whose world had just collapsed. Juliet held him tightly, her own body trembling with the weight of his grief. "You're not alone," she whispered into his hair. "You still have me. We still have each other." They stayed that way for a long time, mother and son bound together in sorrow. Outside, the night went on, indifferent. Across the street, Julian and Allison laughed, unaware that their fortress of secrecy had already crumbled. When Daniel finally lifted his head, his eyes were red, his face set in determination. "I want to see them," he said hoarsely. "I need to look them in the eye." Juliet studied him, torn between the urge to shield him and the need to let him stand in the truth. Slowly, she nodded. "Then we will, but not tonight. Tonight you rest. Tomorrow they will face what they've done." Daniel wiped his face with the back of his hand. "I'll never forgive them." Juliet's heart ached at the certainty in his tone, but she did not argue. Forgiveness was not possible yet. Perhaps it never would be. She took his hand, squeezing it. "Remember, Daniel, they may have betrayed us, but they cannot take everything. They cannot take who we are." For the first time that night, Daniel's grip tightened in return. He nodded, silent but resolute. Together, they sat in Mrs. Peterson's living room, the clock ticking steadily toward dawn. A mother and her son, broken yet bound more tightly than ever, bracing for the confrontation that would end the life they once knew and begin another. The morning after Daniel's tears, Juliet felt the weight of 40 years pressing on her shoulders. She woke before the sun, brewed coffee she did not drink, and spread the stack of evidence across the kitchen table. Photographs of Julian and Allison at restaurants, in hotels, in parking lots. The audio recordings Thomas had captured, Julian's voice promising that the bakery would soon be theirs. The contract drafts that had landed in her own hands like a mockery. Daniel joined her quietly, his eyes swollen from the night before. He sat without speaking, studying the images as if each one were a fresh wound. His hands shook when he picked up the recorder and replayed the whisper of Allison's voice, dripping with contempt. "The old hag's gone, isn't she?" Juliet reached across the table, covering his hand with hers. You see now, I didn't want you to, but you had to. Daniel's jaw tightened. They lied to me, both of them. I've run into burning buildings with less fear than I feel right now. His voice cracked, but he steadied himself. I can't let this go. Juliet nodded. She had known this day was coming, the day her son's illusions would burn away, leaving only ash. Then we won't, she said simply. That afternoon, Thomas delivered his final report. Photographs of Julian and Allison leaving the law office, speaking with a notary, whispering plans of ownership transfer. They are moving fast. He warned, if you don't act, your bakery could slip through your hands before the week is over. Juliet accepted the folder, her fingers brushing against the crisp paper. We'll act, she said. The opportunity arrived sooner than expected. 2 nights later, Julian returned home earlier than usual, his face flushed from wine, a stack of papers tucked beneath his arm. He placed them on the kitchen table with a flourish, as though presenting her with a gift. These are the contracts I told you about, he said smoothly. It's time we expand. It's complicated, Juliet. You'll probably need me to explain, but trust me, this will make everything easier for us. Juliet looked at him steadily. Why don't we go over them together, tonight? Julian hesitated, his eyes flickering with something she recognized, fear disguised as bravado. He poured himself another glass of wine, stalling. There's no rush. But Juliet had already sent a message. The front door opened, and Daniel stepped inside, his uniform still smelling faintly of smoke. He carried the folder Thomas had prepared, evidence neatly bound. Julian froze, the color draining from his face. Daniel, he said, forcing a smile, what are you doing here? Daniel's eyes burned as he set the folder down beside the contracts. Looking for the truth, Dad. The room thickened with silence. Julian's smile faltered. Allison entered then, summoned by some unseen signal, her heels clicking on the floor. She stopped short when she saw Daniel, her face paling beneath her makeup. Daniel, she stammered. I didn't expect. No, Daniel interrupted, his voice like steel. You didn't expect me to know, but I do. He opened the folder, scattering photographs across the table. Julian and Allison together, their hands entwined, their lips pressed in secret. The audio transcript, Allison's words etched in ink, the old hag's gone, isn't she? Juliet stood back, letting her son face the truth directly. Her heart ached for him, but this confrontation belonged to Daniel now. Julian tried to recover, his tone pleading. Son, listen to me. This isn't what it looks like. It's exactly what it looks like. Daniel's fist slammed the table, rattling the glasses. You betrayed Mom, you betrayed me. And you, he turned to Allison, his voice breaking. You were my wife, my partner, how could you? Allison's lips trembled, but no words came. Neighbors would later say they heard shouting that night, voices raised in anger and grief. Some claimed they saw silhouettes through the window, Daniel standing tall while Julian sagged in his chair, defeated. Others swore they saw Allison leave the house in tears, her heels clattering down the street. Inside, Juliet remained calm, her hands folded in front of her. She had prepared for this moment, rehearsed it in silence. When Julian reached for her, begging for her to understand, she pulled a thick envelope from the drawer and placed it firmly on the table. Divorce papers, she said evenly. Sign them. Julian blinked, stunned. Juliet, please, we can talk. There is nothing left to talk about. Her voice was quiet, but it cut deeper than any shout. You made your choice, now live with it. Daniel stood at her side, his hand resting on her shoulder. For the first time in years, Juliet felt strong, not because the pain was gone, but because she was no longer carrying it alone. Julian's shoulders slumped. He looked at the evidence spread across the table, at his son's unyielding eyes, at the woman he had once promised the world. Slowly, with a shaking hand, he picked up a pen. The sound of his signature scratching across the paper was the sound of an ending. 40 years condensed into a single line of ink. When it was done, Juliet gathered the papers calmly. You will not take my bakery. "You will not take my son. Whatever you thought you could build with her, it ends here." Julian dropped the pen, his face ashen. Allison wept silently, her mascara streaking down her cheeks. Daniel turned to his mother, his voice rough but steady. "Let's go, Mom." Together, they walked out of the kitchen, leaving Julian and Allison in the ruins of their own making. Outside, the night air was cool, fresh. Juliet breathed deeply, as though for the first time in years. The house behind them was filled with betrayal, but at her side was Daniel, her son, her anchor, her proof that sacrifice had not been wasted. And though tears blurred her vision, they were no longer the tears of weakness. They were the tears of release. The days that followed felt lighter, though the scars remained. Juliet woke each morning before sunrise, the same way she always had, but this time she wasn't alone. Daniel moved about the bakery beside her, his broad shoulders bent over invoices, his voice steady as he confirmed orders with hotels and restaurants. "Mom," he said one morning, his eyes brighter than they had been in weeks, "the Grand Hotel wants to double their order of sweet pastries." Juliet smiled, her hands still dusted with flour. "Then we'll bake twice as much, we can handle it." The bakery, once a place where Juliet carried everything on her own, now felt alive again. She and Daniel shared the load, shared the silence, and even shared moments of laughter that felt like small miracles. Customers noticed the change, too. They lingered longer, complimenting Juliet on her strength. "You're an inspiration," one woman said softly as she bought a loaf of bread. Juliet nodded graciously, though only she knew the nights she still cried quietly, the memories that still cut deep. At home, the house had changed. Julian was gone, his belongings packed away, the sound of his footsteps no longer echoing in the hallway. Allison had disappeared from their lives, her betrayal a wound that would take time to heal. Yet without them, the house felt strangely new, emptier. Yes, but also cleaner, freer. Juliet no longer walked its rooms with dread. In the evenings, she and Daniel ate dinner at the small kitchen table. Sometimes it was nothing more than bread and soup, but it was enough. They spoke of the day, of deliveries, of small joys. Once, Daniel asked, "Mom, can you make your flan this weekend, like you used to?" Juliet laughed softly. "Only if you help me stir the caramel." For the first time in a long time, hope flickered in her chest. Sundays brought her back to church, where stained glass windows poured colored light across the pews. She prayed, not for Julian or Allison, but for strength for herself, for Daniel, for the family they still had left. She asked for peace, not revenge, and little by little it came. Walking through town with Mrs. Peterson one afternoon, Juliet heard the whispers that still circulated. People were still talking about Julian and Allison, about the scandal that had spread like wildfire. But when they looked at Juliet, their eyes carried admiration, not pity. "She's the one who survived," they said. "She's the strong one." Juliet smiled politely, though inside she knew strength was not something she had chosen, it was what life had demanded of her. Yet perhaps that was enough. As weeks turned into months, the bakery flourished. Daniel found solace in its daily rhythm, and Juliet found comfort in his presence. The betrayal had cost them much, but it had not destroyed them. Instead, it had stripped away the falsehoods, leaving only what was real. A mother and her son, united by love, determined to move forward. One evening, after locking up the bakery, Juliet stood outside beneath the soft glow of the streetlight. The air smelled of yeast and sugar, of work and hope. Daniel joined her, his hand resting lightly on her shoulder. "You know, Mom," he said quietly, "they tried to take everything from us, but they failed. We still have this. We still have each other." Juliet looked at him, her heart swelling. "Yes," she whispered. And that's more than enough. Together, they walked home, the night stretching before them not as a threat, but as a promise. To all of you who have followed Juliet's journey in this story, thank you. Stories of family, sacrifice, and betrayal remind us that even in the darkest moments, there can be light. I wish you and your loved ones health, peace, and happiness. May your homes be filled not with silence of secrets, but with the laughter of trust. Until next time, take care of yourselves and take care of each other.